Hey, AP Lit students, this is Mrs. Daniels. I hope all of you are doing well. Clearly, we are all navigating uncharted territory, and I hope that everyone is being successful in doing so. Much like all of us in our general and everyday lives doing so, College Board is also in territory they have never been in before. And so you obviously know that AP exams are going to look a lot different this year. As AP Lit students, probably at this point from your teachers, you're going to be seeing a prose style question. What that means essentially is that you will see an essay question that then has a passage that falls underneath it, and you'll be asked to use that passage as your evidence in responding and analyzing it based on what the questions ask. I'm going to show you a couple of examples, one using a passage from Sound and the Fury and one using a passage from Beloved. And ultimately, your assignment today is just going to kind of workshop through those questions and those passages to figure out how you would write a thesis for one of those if you happen to see it on exam day. First of all, though, I know we throw this word prose around quite a bit, and I want to make sure that we really have a strong understanding of what it means. Essentially, prose is a form of language that has no structure to it. So it's totally unlike a sonnet where we have three quatrains and a couplet. We're not looking for stuff like that when we're talking about prose, right? Prose essentially reflects the natural flow of speech. It's very conversational. It's how you think about conversations that you've had in your mind. It's how you have conversations if they were to be dictated by somebody and written down as you were having them, and recorded in a sense. Okay, you would hear a very natural pause in people. You would hear probably some inquisitive nature by others, things like that. Authors tend to appreciate the style for a lot of those reasons. It allows for a lot of creative style. It allows for a lot of creative use in their writing. Think about the way Faulkner has some of his dialogue jump back to the past and then immediately back to the present without much indication of things. Think about some of the stream of consciousness that's used. Morrison can have a full page in some of her chapters with only one single period at the end of it, or a lot of fragmented thoughts. We don't always speak in full sentences, right? We don't always have conversations that don't break off from one another. And so a lot of times authors use prose and experiment with it to have these passages that reflect somewhat natural conversations built into their novels. So then there's some particular types of prose. We have the nonfiction prose, which would be biographies, essays, things like that. If you wrote, or I'm sorry, if you did write, but if you read Toni Morrison's Noble Speech lecture, that would be an example of nonfiction prose. A fictional prose piece would be essentially something that's all been imagined or created. So you would think about any of the novels essentially that you've read, or even short stories that you've read. Heroic prose would take you back probably more so to like freshman year when you were reading a lot of the Greek myths and reading about different legends and traditions and things of that nature. And then prose poetry tends to use a lot more imagery, tends to have a lot more emotional effects built into it. It is written in prose as opposed to verse, and there probably is some that can argue that Morrison's writing is poetic, right? Or even with Faulkner and the chaos that he presents in his writing, there probably could be some poetic notions pulled out of those pieces, but ultimately they are novels themselves. So what I want to show you now is essentially, I'm going to scroll back up here, a prose essay question and a passage that would follow. This one in particular is for The Sound and the Fury. Now I'm going to click over in a second to the same question, but with a passage from Beloved following underneath it. So you'll be able to see how some of these questions could essentially be used for varying pieces of literature. The question reads, read the following passage carefully, then write an essay discussing the ways in which the author develops the characters portrayed in this excerpt. Pay particular note to the different literary devices that the author uses in his characterizations. Consider such literary elements as imagery, tone, narrative techniques, and point of view. A couple things that I want to point out there. One, I want you to note that the question is asking for you to really pay attention to the characters portrayed in this excerpt. I know it's really easy and probably a natural inclination that when you've read a full text to kind of grab hold to everything that you know about that book. When we're looking at these prose questions, we're looking for this very select piece of literature and the analysis that can be made about that, okay? You don't want to add in and pull too much information from other places when all that's presented to you is a material that you're looking at now, okay? The other thing I want to mention, I'm sure that your teachers have talked about this before. College Board tends to give these hints and questions, right? Like, it might be nice if you consider these different elements: imagery, tone, narrative techniques, and point of view. I don't want you to feel like you have to have something to say about every single one of those ideas, okay? You don't want your essay to become just a list of where those things exist in the passage. It's not about where they exist, it's how they exist, how they're functioning, things of that nature. You might find one of those elements to really be the one that you want to essentially elaborate on, and you might be able to write a full essay on it. You might pick two of those things, but I don't want you to ever feel like you have to try to squeeze all of those aspects from the question in. Okay, so you then would continue on, obviously, with reading the excerpt from the text with that question in mind. Ultimately, then what you're going to do is answer these 4 questions. And this is just kind of a workshop to get you more familiar with the prose response. First of all, you're going to summarize what the question's asking. We want to make sure that as writers, we're really responding and understanding what the question is, right? We don't want to go off onto tangents. We don't want to respond to something that wasn't asked of us. We want to be able to focus in and make sure we really know what the question wants us to do. Second thing we want to do is identify how the author is characterizing those in the passage. Remember, this is only those in the passage. This is not you starting to include all these different characters that you might know about from the book just to prove to them you've read it. Okay? What traits can be inferred about those present based on the dialogue and the actions of others? You know, it's that old saying, actions speak louder than words. Sometimes there's a lot of things we can figure out as a reader, not from what's said, but by what is done. The third question here is, how is the author's style and inclusion of literary techniques conveying those ideas noted in your question to brainstorm? So you would look above to your answers and consider things like how the imagery added to the depiction of the characters, or how the tone was emphasizing these qualities. And that third kind of bulleted point there, it's how the implication of who is and isn't given a voice in the passage that you read can play into things, or what's being said and thought about individuals in the passage without there being much of a response to them. Okay. Question number 4 is essentially you trying to craft a potential thesis as if you were provided this prompt on exam day. Okay. And then what will happen is your teachers will provide some feedback, and hopefully can help with any weak points that they are seeing kind of routinely, and give everyone back some larger whole class feedback about the strengths and weaknesses of the statements that were written. For those of you who are going to work through the beloved passage, you're going to see something just alike. It's the same exact essay question. Again, you're reading the passage carefully. Write an essay discussing the ways in which the author develops the characters portrayed in this excerpt. Pay particular note to the different literary devices that the author uses in his characterizations. Consider literary elements as imagery, tone, narrative techniques, and point of view. And I just want to mention the same thing. Again, we are only talking about the characters portrayed in the excerpt. And again, we don't have to include every single one of these literary elements in our essays, okay? Remind yourself you don't want to make a grocery list, right? We don't want to just identify or play a matching game where we're just identifying where these things exist. We want to have something substantial to say about a couple of those ideas, okay? So again, you would read then the beloved excerpt, takes you again just through that first page, and then answer the same questions the students working through the Sound and the Fury passage will be doing. You're going to summarize the prompt to make sure you can put it in your own words, identify how the author is characterizing those in the passage, and I would suggest that these can just be brainstorm lists for anyone that exists in the reading, and then also just kind of working through some of those specific literary elements. What does exist? What can be used out of imagery, tone, narrative technique, things of that nature to help you formulate an essay. And then ultimately, again, you're not writing the full essay, you are just crafting a potential thesis. If you had to sit down the day of the exam and write about this in particular, what would be your argumentative statement?